So I'm introducing Hannah Connell, who is a PhD candidate in history at King's College London and also collaborates with the British Library. Her research focuses on migration and diaspora through Russian language publishing. The title of her doctoral thesis, which she's going to discuss very soon, she said before, is Sovremennye zapiski in the world of Russian language émigré periodicals in Paris, 1920-1940. As a collaborative doctoral partnership student, she's also curated a UK Web Archive special collection, Russian in the UK, a resource that collects websites relating to the Russian-speaking diaspora in the UK. So today, Hannah will give a presentation titled Uncovering the Relationships Between Periodicals Through Editorial Correspondence, Networks of Russian Language Émigré Periodicals in Interwar Paris. Hannah, please. There you are. Couldn't see you.
Thank you very much, Mara, and thank you for this opportunity to present a paper as part of the series. As you can see, my title is slightly different, but I hope that I fulfill the sort of the hopes of the original title. I'll be drawing on some of the research which I've undertaken for my thesis into the published and edited correspondence which surrounds this Russian language thick journal, Contemporary Notes, and I'll use the titles in translation. This quarterly journal, it was published by Russian émigrés in Paris between 1920 and 1940 in 70 issues of roughly 400 pages each. Could I have the next slide, please, Micah? Thank you. So broadly, my thesis examines the correspondence between the five editors of this journal over 20 years. It was Contemporary Notes was a literary and socio-political journal, and it was edited by members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party abroad. And I think that these two pillars of its identity are particularly important. The political platform, which emphasized the democratic ideals of the February Revolution in 1917, and its literary platform, which preserved pre-revolutionary cultural values and the best of what they considered to be the best of Russian literature. And throughout my PhD, I've been drawing on several important sources beyond the periodical text, which I think shed light on the editorship of this particular journal. And so alongside this correspondence, which has been published in 4 edited volumes and is quite extensive, there are memoirs and reviews of this journal across the émigré press, which are particularly important. But one significant memoir was actually written by one of the editors of Contemporary Notes, Mark Vishniak, and published in 1957. And this is where he detailed his editorial role and his relationship with his colleagues. And this memoir, the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because it characterizes Contemporary Notes in a particular way. It characterizes this journal as a significant part of a wider émigré cultural mission. And it discusses émigré publishing as a philanthropic or vocational endeavor. And I think that this narrative particularly reflects the economic difficulties which were encountered by émigré editors in producing periodicals abroad. And it implies that producing journals such as Contemporary Notes was not or could not be driven by profit. And as such, émigré publishing is often portrayed in this way as a vocation in studies of this period. But through this editorial correspondence, I've become increasingly interested in the ways in which commercial decisions begin to enter the day-to-day experiences of editorship and how they might qualify or complicate this sort of altruistic image of émigré periodical publishing. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And so this image of Paris, I think, is particularly interesting because I think it represents the ways in which these periodicals appeared within a much wider Russian language publishing market in interwar France. And just to the right of the Eiffel Tower above the river, you can actually see 2 newspaper vendors in sort of two rival newspaper sellers in competition, which is why I like this image. And I think that the correspondence between the editors of contemporary notes contains details of these forms of competition and collaboration. So yes, explaining why this image I think is particularly helpful for understanding the broader sort of periodical publishing market. So I actually want to talk about two curious instances of these collaborative and competitive processes behind the scenes of producing journals, which I've come across in the editorial correspondence. And I like the way that Nora kind of spoke about sources beyond the periodical text as messy, because I think that what I've tried to do is to collect bits of relevant correspondence from across this period to try and understand these relationships between periodicals, which are not necessarily the images of these relationships are not complete in the correspondence. But nevertheless, I think that these incomplete sort of narratives, they do offer some insight into the development, not only of this particular journal, but also of émigré periodical publishing across this interwar period. So alongside contemporary notes, there are several émigré titles which lasted for the duration of the interwar period, such as the daily newspapers that I will be discussing as part of my first case study. But there are also many journals, periodicals, which appeared for only a brief period. And despite their short-lived publications, their impact could be quite profound. And this dynamic of mutual influence is what I'd like to discuss in this second case study. And it's important to sort of acknowledge that much of this information on editorship, which appears in the correspondence, is visible only at moments when the editors disagree with each other or there's some form of conflict that needs to be discussed. And as such, it's not often possible to ascertain exactly when or how a relationship has been established. But the impact of these relationships between periodicals and the value that they held for different parties, I think can be seen particularly clearly in these discussions in the correspondence. And just as a context, the two case studies I wish to look at, they occurred at the height of the journal's external success. By the late 1920s, the reputation of Contemporary Notes had been consolidated as the most prestigious thick journal within the Russian emigration. And in 1928, the establishment of a printing house under the same name promised to extend the journal's prestige even further. But I think that these two sort of messy incidents in the correspondence, they suggest ways in which this external visible stability and success was actually less secure than it seemed. Micah, could you give me the next slide, please? Thank you. So in this first case study, I will look at the commercial and ideological relationships with the émigré press, because the editors of Contemporary Notes had a commercial relationship with an émigré newspaper, which shared their political outlook in emigration. And this newspaper was the Latest News, and it reflected the liberal politics of the Constitutional Democratic Party, which, like the party behind Sovremennye's, Contemporary Notes, is a pre-revolutionary Russian political party. And the Latest News was one of the most influential dailies in Paris, and it was published between 1920 and 1940. And I think that the contract between these two journals reflected a general political coalition between the parties behind these periodicals, which sought to unify liberal and socialist groups abroad. And the significance of their professional relationship was reinforced by the ideological ties between the periodicals. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And so the content of this contract is that subscribers to this daily newspaper could receive Contemporary Notes for a discounted rate of 10 francs, which was less than half the price per issue of buying this journal from a bookseller at 25 francs at this time. And this relationship with the Latest News, I think, was particularly valuable to the editors of Contemporary Notes. The agreement not only increased the visibility and circulation of the journal within the émigré community, it's also clear from the correspondence between editors that it was an important channel for distributing the journal. And in a letter to his colleagues, one of the editors, Ilya Fundaminsky, notes in 1929 that of roughly 1,600 copies of the 34th issue of Contemporary Notes in 1928, more than half had been sent to the subscribers to the latest news. And this commercial side of the relationship becomes particularly clear in the editorial correspondence. And it emerges at a point, it becomes particularly clear at this point in early 1929, when the editors of Contemporary Notes are forced to protect their contract with the latest news. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And this is because there is a new conflict with another daily émigré newspaper, Renaissance, which appears in the correspondence in March 1929. Renaissance had been established to counter this influence of the left liberal publishing among émigrés. It was the longest running and one of the most recognizable names among the monarchist publications in immigration, sort of center-right political publication. It was first published in 1925 and backed by a wealthy entrepreneur, Abraham Osipovich Gukasov, who was also behind the really prolific printing house, the Imprimerie de Navarre, which published a wide range of Russian language periodicals of differing political and cultural affiliations. And in the letters between the editors of Contemporary Notes, it's clear that Renaissance had attempted to offer to its subscribers discounted issues of Contemporary Notes, and that this situation threatened the contract which existed between the thick journal and the latest news. And the precise sequence of these events is difficult to uncover, but there's an article in the Russian language press in Berlin at this time, which has suggested that the latest news was driven by a fear of losing its privileged position among readers in émigré publishing, and that they had pressured the editors of Contemporary Notes to prevent Renaissance from benefiting from the same strategy. And so there's a letter which is included, interestingly, in this published correspondence that the editor Ilya Vandaminsky wrote to Gukasov to explain that the latest news, in fact, had a monopoly on this right to offer Contemporary Notes at a discount. And this letter claimed that under this contract, the editors of Contemporary Notes simply could not agree to a similar arrangement with anyone else. And they requested that Gukasov publish this letter openly so that the situation could be clarified for the readers of Renaissance. And this article, which had appeared in the Berlin-based newspaper, the Rudder, I think makes the stakes of this conflict particularly clear, because the journalist notes that the sort of fundamental incongruity of a monarchist newspaper circulating a socialist thick journal, but his comments are reserved mainly for the latest news. And he sort of comments quite slyly that if the latest news considers, and the quotation, if the latest news considers the distribution of the journal to be important and desirable, then the impetus which another newspaper will bring to this can only be welcomed. Or perhaps it's just as true that politics is politics and business is business. And you see the separation of these two spheres quite clearly here. And I find this comment very interesting because it reveals the tensions which I see at the heart of émigré publishing, this question of the clear political boundaries which had defined polemics in the press for so long, and the incompatibility of these boundaries for commercial success in such a small market. Could I have the next slide, please? So in his letters to colleagues, Vandaminsky at first emphasizes the need for Contemporary Notes to remain loyal to the latest news in this dispute. But this letter that he wrote to Gukasov was not published in Renaissance, and the dispute continued for several months. And by May 1929, Vandaminsky had come to the conclusion that this unresolved dispute was in fact damaging to all parties, and that and significantly damaging to the cultural mission of the emigration as a whole. And I think it's useful to consider that this dispute in the wider context of the production of this journal at this point because by 1929, the cultural front of contemporary notes had shifted considerably from where it started. The journal also struggled to fill its pages, and financing for each forthcoming issue was increasingly uncertain. And the growing recognition over the 1920s that Russian emigres would not soon return to their homeland had rendered these ideological concerns, which defined political polemics of the early 1920s, less and less relevant, and pragmatic and professional editorship became increasingly important. And so Fundaminsky writes to his colleague Vishniak that, and I quote, "We should not enter into a polemic with Renaissance, but must maintain an official perspective insistently. There is no need to transfer such polemics onto ideological grounds. The professional front is indisputable and therefore profitable," end quote. In general, he believed that there was no need to escalate this conflict, as Renaissance would not actually be able to acquire more than a few hundred copies of contemporary notes, and eventually would have to give up this fight. And he also suggested that Gukasov's intention was to raise the profile of Renaissance, and that he had intended to provoke the latest news with this unprofessional behavior, and that therefore the sooner that the whole issue just subsided, the better it would be for the relationship between these newspapers. And I think that this development is interesting because it suggests that despite the strong identification with certain audiences and political agenda, the editors of contemporary notes were actually willing to compromise quite significantly, even these very clear early political lines which had been laid down. And the outcome of this dispute is not clear from the edited correspondence I've consulted, and I think there's a lot more space for research into this, but I think that this incident highlights the self-awareness among editors and readers and writers of these diverging political and cultural currents which characterize the émigré publishing landscape, as well as a recognition that profitability and business contracts also shape this market. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this model of mutual advertising or promotion, which I see as part of this offer of discounted issues, it was later extended beyond Paris to a Russian language daily, which was based in Riga. And the extent to which such agreements could be mutually beneficial for Russian language periodicals is evident in later letters in the 1930s, which are sent to the editors by a long-standing contributor of contemporary notes. Fyodor Sepun, this contributor, informs the editors that in his travels to Stockholm and Oslo, he has become acquainted with members of the Russian-speaking community who would be interested in subscribing to the journal. And among the individuals he mentions is a former imperial consul of slender means who wishes to subscribe to the newspaper in Riga in order to receive discounted copies of contemporary notes. Notably, in Stepun's list of individuals with an interest in receiving the journal, most either have a subscription to an émigré newspaper or would take out such a subscription in order to receive the discounted copies of the journal. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And to move sort of quickly to the second case study, which shifts the attention to the literary contents of contemporary notes, I think that there are similar dynamics in the background to this case study. Reviews and correspondence, I believe, reveal another sort of core tension at the heart of émigré publishing, which is between the preservation of pre-revolutionary culture and the emergences of new literary trends. And contemporary notes is often considered emblematic of Russian literary tradition and established writers. But this incident suggests that there's a much more complicated relationship between this continuation of tradition and the fostering of new talent abroad. So just to offer a bit of background, the Russian language émigré publishing market had flourished in the mid-1920s when a number of small literary periodicals devoted to emerging trends in Russian language literature abroad had begun to appear, and they're often short-lived. But there was a distinct belief among writers that a new generation of writers was forming, and that this so-called young generation lacked a concrete foundation, but that this foundation might be offered by the establishment of new periodicals specifically for different literary groups. And so in 1930, a new modernist thick journal, Numbers, appeared. And at roughly 300 pages per issue, it rivaled Contemporary Notes in length. But in contrast to the older journal, it completely renounced politics and promised a platform purely devoted to literature. And it claimed to be the voice of this new generation. According to a poet of this young generation, Boris Poplavsky, it was the first forum in which émigré writers felt themselves liberated from the political intrigue of the emigration. And throughout its publishing life, both Numbers and Contemporary Notes were compared and evaluated together. And though Numbers was often criticized for consisting largely of authors whose careers had already started in emigration in the publishing in Contemporary Notes, it increasingly came to be seen as a laboratory in which new writers could develop their craft. Where Contemporary Notes was perceived to be frustratingly reliable and predictable, the editors of Numbers were praised as well as ridiculed for the risks that they took in publishing new work. And I think it's important to note as well here that Numbers differed from Contemporary Notes not only in its editorial program, but also in its structure. Instead of serialized works spread over several issues, Numbers included mainly extracts and fragments of literary works, brief articles on cultural topics, an extensive poetry section, and color reproductions of contemporary art. And I think that Numbers developed in defiance of and through building upon the literary foundations of Contemporary Notes. And the comparisons drawn by contemporaries between the two journals, which had little of substance to distinguish the two journals at the beginning, begins to reveal the ways in which the role of this journal, Numbers, in the émigré market grew out of this practice of comparison, solidifying the perceived identity of each journal. The relationship between Numbers and Contemporary Notes over the course of the 1930s reveals the evolution of, more broadly, of émigré literary periodicals during this period. Numbers built upon a literary field which had been cultivated by Contemporary Notes. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is that Contemporary Notes in the mid-1930s would turn to look at Numbers for a model which reflected contemporary émigré audiences. Could I have the next slide, please? And to that point, I think editors and contributors increasingly point to the need for Contemporary Notes to adapt to attract new readers. In March 1934, the editor van der Minsky had written to his colleague that Contemporary Notes has become provincial and it does not reflect what is happening in the world. He recommended a range of measures to invigorate the journal. And I think that his proposals for modernizing the editorial practice and content of Contemporary Notes arise from a fear of inertia in the journal's content. And as part of this program to make the journal more attractive to readers, van der Minsky suggested increasing the number of authors from the young generation and, which I consider particularly significant, restructuring a substantial section of Contemporary Notes to resemble the cultural sections of magazines such as Numbers. And I see in this letter quite a significant instance in which a culturally authoritative journal turns to a less established rival for a model of regeneration. The editors of Contemporary Notes, I think they begin to recognize the need to remain relevant for their audience in accepting a more experimental model for content for the journal. And this incident reveals not only the significance that Numbers had established in just 4 years of publication, but also that the influence of Contemporary Notes on its wider environments didn't flow in one direction. Could I have the final slide, please? Thank you. And so just a few words to wrap up. I think that this correspondence, to my mind, helps to make the relationships which are visible on the pages of these periodicals more concrete. For instance, the relationship between the latest news and Contemporary Notes, which reflects the similarity of their political platforms, is reinforced and deepened by this commercial relationship. But it also allows some of the messy details of negotiating these commercial ties to become visible, such as when the ideological connection between the the latest news and contemporary notes is threatened by its political rival Renaissance, the editors actually choose to allow this association to continue because the conflict itself would potentially be more harmful than the blurring of these political boundaries. And so finally, I think that it's interesting to me, and I think there's a lot more perhaps that could be said about these incidents, but the connection between contemporary notes and other Russian language émigré periodicals was particularly complex, and it can't be clearly defined as either competitive or collaborative. Editors often made practical compromises in collaborating with periodicals of opposing interests in the name of survival. Thank you.